The most dangerous prisoner's last wish is to see his dog. What happened next shocked everyone. The cold walls of the prison held no warmth, no life, just silence, thick and suffocating. The air was stale, carrying the scent of metal, sweat, and time that had long since run out. Daniel Reeves sat on the edge of his cot, his fingers loosely interlocked, his eyes staring at the floor. His once strong hands, calloused from years of labor, now rested idly, as if even they had surrendered to fate. He had spent 10 years in this cell waiting. Tomorrow he would die. He had never spoken much, never begged for mercy, never asked for redemption. The guards called him cold, unfeeling, a monster, a man who deserved what was coming. But when the warden stood in front of him and asked for his last wish, Daniel finally spoke. "I want to see my dog." A simple request, and yet it stunned the entire prison. The man who had spent a decade behind bars, never shedding a tear, never requesting a visitor, was asking for a dog? The guards exchanged confused glances. Some scoffed, others whispered, but the warden simply studied him, unreadable. "You understand that this isn't a guarantee?" Daniel nodded. He had no expectations, no hope. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that this single request would change everything. Because somewhere out there a dog was waiting, and when they finally reunited, what happened next would leave the world in shock. The prison lights flickered slightly as Daniel sat motionless, his body tense but his face expressionless. The request he had made moments ago still hung in the air, and he could feel the quiet shift among the guards outside his cell. A dog. Of all things, the man they had labeled the most dangerous prisoner on death row had requested to see a dog. None of them understood, but then again, no one ever had. Daniel Reeves had once been a name that commanded respect, a decorated K-9 officer, one of the best in his field. He had served for years alongside his partner, a German shepherd named Ace, a dog that had saved his life more times than he could count. He had once believed in the justice system, believed in law, in order, in doing the right thing. But that was before the incident, before the night his entire life shattered, before the world decided he was a murderer. It had been a cold, rainy night when it happened. Daniel had been off duty, grabbing a late-night coffee at a gas station just a few blocks from his apartment. Ace sat obediently in the passenger seat of his truck, ears perked, always on alert. That's when the shots rang out. The sound split through the air like a thunderclap, sending customers diving to the ground. Daniel's instincts kicked in immediately. Gun drawn, he moved toward the entrance, his pulse steady despite the chaos. Inside, a masked man stood at the counter, a gun aimed at the trembling clerk. Daniel had seen enough of these situations to know that one wrong move could turn deadly. "Put the gun down," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. The man hesitated. For a moment, Daniel thought he had reached him, but then the trigger was pulled. A deafening crack echoed through the small store. The clerk collapsed instantly, blood pooling at his feet. Daniel fired back. The suspect staggered, hit in the shoulder, but before Daniel could reach him, another shot rang out from somewhere in the shadows. A second figure hidden in the back aisle. Daniel felt the impact before he heard it. A sharp, searing pain tore through his side, sending him crashing to the ground. The world spun, sounds blurred, and then nothing. When he woke up, the store was surrounded by flashing lights. His gun was missing. The security cameras had been tampered with, and the only suspect was already dead. The police found him lying there, gunshot wound fresh, his prints on the counter, the gun supposedly used in the crime resting near his hand. They had their killer. Daniel had fought to explain, to tell them there had been a second shooter, that someone had framed him. But the evidence was damning. The security footage from the store was corrupted. The suspect's gun matched his service pistol, his missing pistol. The prosecution painted him as a fallen cop, a man who had turned on the very system he once served. No one believed his story. Not the jury, not the judge, not even his own former colleagues. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. First-degree murder. Death sentence. And just like that, Daniel Reeves, the once respected officer, the war hero, the man who had dedicated his life to serving others, became the monster the world now saw him as. Time moved differently behind bars. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Daniel had stopped marking the passage of time a long time ago. The beginning had been the hardest. The rage, the betrayal, the endless cycle of wondering how things had gone so wrong. But over time, he stopped caring, stopped fighting, stopped speaking. He didn't appeal. He didn't argue with the guards. He didn't fight the system. Let them think he was a monster. It was easier that way, because deep down, the only thing that mattered had already been taken from him. The name had stayed buried in his mind, locked away in a place he never dared to revisit. He never knew what had happened to him. The night of his arrest, they had taken Ace away, dragging him from the back of Daniel's truck as he barked and struggled. Daniel had pleaded for them not to separate them. But his badge meant nothing anymore. His rank, his years of service, none of it mattered. Ace had been his partner, his best friend, the one constant in his life. But just like everything else, he was gone. For 10 years, Daniel had asked for nothing. No visitors, no last-minute appeals, no letters. But as the final days approached, something inside him shifted. Death was coming, swift and certain. And yet, instead of fear, all he could think about was Ace. Where was he? Was he still alive? Did he ever wonder what had happened that night? The thought of dying without knowing, without one last chance to see him, it was the only thing Daniel couldn't accept. So, when the warden stood in front of him, asking for his last wish, the words had slipped out before he could stop them. "I want to see my dog." The guards had laughed. Some even scoffed, muttering about how ridiculous it was. But the warden didn't laugh. He just watched Daniel, his expression unreadable. "You understand that this isn't a guarantee?" he had asked. Daniel nodded. Of course, he understood. Hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to. But for the first time in 10 years, he held on to it anyway. The night Daniel was arrested, Ace had been left behind. The last thing Daniel remembered was the sound of his frantic barking, the sharp scrape of paws against metal as the officers dragged him from the truck. He had tried to lunge forward, had snarled and snapped, desperate to get to Daniel, but the leash held tight. Then the door slammed shut, and Ace was gone. The officers who had taken Ace didn't know what to do with him at first. A fully trained K9 dog was valuable, but Ace was aggressive, confused, and uncooperative. He wasn't just another police dog, he was Daniel's dog, and he refused to follow commands from anyone else. The first few days he waited, sat by the entrance of the station, ears perked, watching every uniformed officer who passed by, expecting Daniel to return. When he didn't, Ace stopped eating. He lay on the cold concrete floor of the station's kennel, barely moving, barely lifting his head when anyone approached. Days turned into weeks. Some officers suggested reassigning him, training him with another handler. But Ace wouldn't listen. He ignored commands, refused to engage in exercises. He was still waiting for his handler, his partner, his person. As weeks passed, the department made the decision. Ace couldn't stay. They tried to adopt him out, but he wouldn't bond with anyone. Multiple families came to see him, experienced handlers, retired officers, even those familiar with K9 units. Ace rejected them all. He wouldn't play, wouldn't react. He just sat there, staring at the door, waiting. Months passed, and the shelter staff grew concerned. Ace was getting older, and his body showed signs of stress. His fur lost its shine. His appetite came and went. One of the officers who had worked with Daniel in the past suggested something no one had considered. What if we send him to the K9 retirement facility? It wasn't common practice. Dogs usually retired with their handlers. But Ace had no handler. So, after months of failed adoptions, Ace was placed in a K9 retirement home, a place where working dogs spent their final years. It wasn't a home, but it was something. At the facility, Ace remained the same. The other dogs, most of them aging and retired, adapted to the slower pace of life. They played in the yard, interacted with caretakers, moved on from their years of service. Ace did not. He kept his routine, waking at the same times he had when he was working. He stared at the gate for hours, as if he expected Daniel to walk through it at any moment. Caretakers noticed something unusual. Unlike the other dogs, Ace never fully rested. Even when he lay down, his ears would twitch, his eyes half open, as if waiting for a sound only he could recognize. A familiar voice, a familiar command, but it never came. For 10 years, no one came looking for him. Then, one day, the phone rang. The warden of a maximum security prison was calling, asking about a dog named Ace. The staff at the K9 retirement home was stunned. "Why?" they asked. Because his owner, Daniel Reeves, requested to see him. Silence. Then someone whispered, "That dog still waits for him." The warden hesitated. Is he still alive? The answer came slowly, but with certainty. Yes, but he's old. And he's been waiting for a long, long time. The logistics weren't easy. Getting a dog into a maximum security prison wasn't something that had ever been done before. The guards, the prison staff, even the warden debated it. Some argued it was a waste of time. Why honor the wish of a man sentenced to death? But others saw it differently. If that dog waited for him all these years, doesn't he deserve to know? So they approved it. And for the first time in 10 years, Ace was loaded into a transport van, heading toward a reunion no one thought would ever happen. When the news spread through the prison that the most dangerous prisoner on death row was getting a visit from a dog, the reaction was mixed. Some guards mocked it. He's got no family, so now we're bringing in a damn mutt? He's probably gonna eat it. Others were more curious. What kind of man sits in a cage for 10 years and only asks for a dog? One thing was certain, everyone wanted to see what would happen. When the transport van pulled up, a crowd of officers stood by, waiting. The doors opened, and an old German shepherd stepped out. His fur was graying around his muzzle, his once powerful frame slightly thinner. But when his paws touched the ground, his ears lifted. His nose twitched, his tail stiffened. Something deep in his bones told him he was here for a reason. And then he smelled him, a scent buried in time, a scent he had never forgotten. And in that moment, Ace knew. His handler was here, and this time he wasn't leaving without him. Inside the prison, Daniel sat in his cell, unaware that Ace had arrived. He had convinced himself it wouldn't happen, that the system wouldn't allow it, that this was just another cruel reminder of how life took everything and gave nothing back. But then, a guard appeared at his door. "Reeves, get up." Daniel frowned. "What for?" "Your request." They approved it. Daniel's breath caught. His heart, hardened by years of solitude, stumbled in his chest. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. He was led out of his cell, hands cuffed, feet shackled. But as he walked toward the meeting room, something inside him, something he thought had died long ago, began to stir. Hope. A few feet away, Ace was waiting. And in mere moments, the world was about to witness something no one would ever forget. The prison halls were eerily quiet as Daniel Reeves was led down the corridor. The rhythmic clinking of his shackles echoed against the cold concrete floors, a haunting reminder of the years he had spent in this place. 10 years of silence. 10 years of waiting. 10 years of nothing. But today was different. Today, something waited for him at the end of the hall. His heart pounded, his palms damp with sweat. He had spent a decade preparing himself for death. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Anticipation. Could Ace really be there? Would he even recognize him? Or was this just another cruel trick of fate? The guards led Daniel to a small visitation room, one that rarely saw use. It was the kind of room reserved for last goodbyes, for prisoners who had run out of time. A single table stood in the center, surrounded by 4 chairs. A metal grate separated the two sides, as if one final barrier was needed between the condemned and the outside world. Daniel's shackles were fastened to a metal loop embedded in the table. Standard procedure. Even now, they still saw him as a threat. He barely noticed. His hands clenched into fists as he waited. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the door creaked open, and Daniel forgot how to breathe. The first thing he saw was the leash. A guard held it tightly, his stance rigid, cautious. Then the dog stepped forward. The air in Daniel's lungs vanished. The once strong, muscular German shepherd now had patches of gray on his muzzle. His movements were slower, more deliberate, but his ears still perked at every sound, and his deep brown eyes still held the fire Daniel remembered. For a moment, Ace froze, his nose twitching, his body still. Then something clicked. Recognition. It was as if a switch had flipped inside the old dog's mind, a light flickering back on after years of darkness. And then he moved, not walked, not trotted, ran. Ace lunged forward so hard that the guard lost his grip on the leash. Daniel barely had time to react before 80 pounds of fur and muscle crashed into him. Ace wasn't barking, wasn't whining, he was crying. A sound so raw, so filled with desperation and love, that every guard in the room froze where they stood. Daniel had spent a decade behind walls that stripped him of his humanity. But at that moment, everything fell away. He collapsed to his knees, shackles clanking against the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ace licked his face, his hands, his wrists, any part of him he could reach. His tail wagged so violently that his entire body trembled with emotion. Daniel wrapped his arms around him, his fingers gripping Ace's fur with a desperation he hadn't known he still had. And then he broke. For the first time in 10 years, Daniel Reeves wept. Not silent tears, not quiet sorrow. He sobbed. Years of pain, anger, betrayal. It all collapsed under the weight of the only living soul who had never abandoned him. The guards had expected many things. They had expected Daniel to stay cold and detached, maybe show mild interest, but nothing more. They had expected Ace to be hesitant, confused, or even uninterested after so many years. They had expected this moment to be nothing more than a man's final request before facing the inevitable. What they had not expected was this: a hardened criminal, a man who never showed emotion, breaking down like a lost child. A dog who had waited a decade, showing more love and loyalty than any human ever could. A reunion so powerful that it left grown men speechless. Some of them had spent years hating Daniel Reeves. They had called him a monster, a killer, a man without remorse. But at that moment, watching him cling to his dog like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline, they saw something different. They saw a man who had lost everything, and somehow, against all odds, had gotten one thing back. And for the first time, they wondered, had they gotten it wrong? Ace was no ordinary dog. He had been trained to detect fear, deceit, guilt. He could smell adrenaline, identify threats, and sense emotions in ways no human ever could. And yet, he showed no fear of Daniel. Not an ounce of hesitation. Dogs didn't lie. They didn't pretend. They didn't manipulate. They simply knew. And Ace knew something they didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the warden, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward. His voice broke the silence. "Unchain him." A murmur rippled through the guards. "Sir?" One of them questioned. "You heard me," the warden said, his gaze locked on Daniel. "Unchain him." There was hesitation, but orders were orders. The shackles were removed. For the first time in 10 years, Daniel felt the weight lift from his wrists. He expected nothing after that. But what came next changed everything. The warden knelt down, eyes level with Ace. "You never forgot him, did you?" he murmured. Ace simply wagged his tail, his body still glued to Daniel's side. The warden straightened. "Reeves, there are people who believe a man like you doesn't deserve another chance." Daniel lifted his gaze, silent. "But I've been a warden for a long time, and I've seen men break in many ways. Seen them beg, seen them lie, seen them curse the world for their own mistakes." The room was still. "But I've never," the warden said, voice firm, "seen a dog wait 10 years for a man who didn't deserve it." Daniel swallowed hard. "I don't know if you're guilty or not," the warden continued, "but I know one thing. That dog knows the truth." And just like that, the world shifted. Daniel Reeves was no longer just a prisoner on death row. He was a man with a story that needed to be told. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Daniel sat on the cold floor, his arms wrapped around Ace, his fingers buried deep in his fur. His breathing was uneven, his body trembling with emotions he had long forgotten how to feel. Ace had waited for him. 10 years. 10 years of silence, of emptiness, of believing there was nothing left for him in this world. But Ace had never let go. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The world had thrown him away, had called him a killer, had sentenced him to die. But this dog, his partner, his best friend, had refused to believe that. Somewhere, deep inside him, something cracked open. A man who had once been nothing but rage and regret was suddenly just a boy with his dog again. The reunion should have been over by now. The guards had expected a quick, emotionless encounter. Instead, they stood frozen, watching the scene unfold before them. Daniel Reeves, the prisoner they had called a cold-blooded murderer, was sobbing on the floor, clutching his dog like a lifeline. And Ace, trained to sense deception, aggression, guilt, wasn't wary. He wasn't hesitant. He was joyful. It made them uncomfortable, because dogs didn't lie. One of the younger guards, Officer Lane, shifted uncomfortably. He had never liked Daniel, never cared about his case. To him, a murderer was a murderer. But this wasn't the reaction of a guilty man. And that dog, Ace, wasn't reacting like someone who had been abandoned by a monster. Lane turned to the warden. "Sir, are we sure we got the right guy?" The warden didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened as he watched Daniel stroke Ace's head, whispering something too low to hear. Then, finally, he murmured, "That's a damn good question." The warden had never questioned Daniel Reeves' guilt before. He had read the court records, seen the evidence. The surveillance footage was corrupted, yes, but there were eyewitnesses. There was a gun found near Daniel's hand. There were forensic reports. It had been enough to convict him. But now, watching Ace's absolute, unwavering loyalty, he wasn't so sure anymore. Dogs had instincts far beyond human comprehension. They could detect fear, stress, deception. If Daniel was truly guilty, if he had truly done something so heinous, why would Ace have never moved on? Why would a dog that had been trained to work alongside only honest men still see Daniel as his master? The warden inhaled slowly, something twisting deep in his gut. Maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong. Later that evening, as Daniel sat in his cell with Ace curled at his feet, he heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and a familiar face stepped inside. Chaplain Edwards. Edwards had been the prison chaplain for years. He had seen men break, had held their hands as they faced their last days. He had never once spoken to Daniel Reeves. Until now. "You've never wanted to talk before?" Edwards said, pulling up a chair. "Why now?" Daniel was silent for a long moment. His hand moved absently over Ace's fur, as if afraid that if he stopped touching him, he would disappear. Finally, he exhaled. "Because he never forgot me." Edwards studied him. "And that surprises you?" Daniel gave a bitter chuckle. "I thought he would move on, find someone new. Dogs do that." "Not always," Edwards said gently. "Not when they know something the rest of us don't." Daniel glanced up. There was something in the chaplain's eyes, something searching. "Did you do it?" Edwards asked. Daniel stiffened. He had been asked this question 100 times. By lawyers, by the police, by the judge who had looked him in the eye and sentenced him to die. He had stopped answering, because no one ever believed him. But now, in this dimly lit prison cell, with Ace resting his head on Daniel's lap, the words slipped out before he could stop them. "No." Edwards didn't flinch, didn't scoff. He just nodded. "I believe you." Word spread fast. The prison chaplain had spoken with Daniel Reeves, and for the first time in a decade, someone on the inside believed him. The warden, still unsettled from the reunion, started digging. What he found sent a chill down his spine. The evidence that had convicted Daniel, it had holes. The surveillance footage had been corrupted, but no one ever investigated why. The fingerprints on the gun were inconclusive, and the key witness, a former cop, had a history of misconduct. The deeper the warden looked, the more uneasy he became. Something wasn't right. One night, a guard named Officer Lane sat in his car outside the prison, staring at an old case file. Something was bothering him. He remembered something from years ago, something about the key witness in Daniel's trial. The man, a former cop named Garrett Wells, had testified that he had seen Daniel commit the murder. But Lane had heard rumors that Wells had falsified evidence before. Lane made a decision. He picked up his phone and made a call. To a journalist. To a man who had been trying to prove Daniel's innocence for years. The next morning, the headlines hit the news. New evidence emerges in controversial death row case. Did the justice system get it wrong? Daniel Reeves' final wish may have uncovered the truth. The media storm that followed was relentless. Protests erupted outside the prison. People demanded a retrial. Lawyers began pushing for an appeal, arguing that the case had been rushed, that critical evidence had been overlooked. And through it all, Daniel sat in his cell, Ace at his side, waiting. For the first time in 10 years, he had something to hope for. And then the governor issued an order. Daniel's execution was officially put on hold. A retrial was set. New evidence was presented. And the truth? The real killer had been someone inside the police force. A man who had used Daniel as the perfect scapegoat. After 10 years, after a decade of being called a monster, Daniel Reeves was exonerated. Not by lawyers, not by the justice system, but by a dog who refused to forget. Ace had waited 10 years to bring his handler home. And in the end, he did. The world outside had changed. The sky was wider, the air was cleaner, and the sun felt warmer against his skin than he remembered. For 10 years, Daniel Reeves had been a prisoner, a dead man walking, a man with nothing to live for, and now, he was free. Ace walked beside him, his steps slow but steady. The dog was older now, his once powerful body slightly frail, but his presence was as unwavering as ever. The cameras outside the prison gates flashed wildly, reporters shouting his name. The world wanted a statement, an explanation, a reaction. But Daniel didn't stop, didn't speak. He just placed a hand on Ace's back and walked away. Because this wasn't the end of his story. This was the beginning. Freedom wasn't what he had expected. The world had kept moving while he had been locked away. His apartment was long gone. The money in his bank account had been drained by legal fees. He had no family waiting for him, no friends, no home, just Ace. For the first few weeks, they slept in a cheap motel, surviving off donations from people who had followed his case. The media frenzy around his exoneration had made him a symbol of justice, but that didn't mean he had a place in the world. He was a former convict, an ex-cop, a man who had lost a decade of his life. What was left for him now? Ace was getting tired. Daniel had seen it happening in slow, painful moments. The way Ace's once powerful strides had softened into careful steps. How his tail wagged just a little slower. How his naps grew longer. The dog had spent 10 years waiting for him. And now he was running out of time. Daniel knew it was coming. But when it finally did, it still shattered him. One morning, Ace didn't wake up. Daniel sat beside him for hours, his fingers resting in the thick fur that had once been so full of life. He didn't cry. Not this time, because Ace had waited. He had waited for him to come home, to be free, to finally have his second chance. And in the end, that was enough. Daniel buried Ace in a quiet field on the outskirts of the city. No gravestone, no markings, just a single worn police badge, placed gently in the dirt. "You saved me, buddy." And then, just like that, he walked away. For weeks, Daniel wandered, lost, alone. But one day, as he sat on a park bench, watching a group of retired police dogs being walked by their handlers, something clicked. He couldn't bring Ace back, but he could honor him. That night, he made a decision. He would dedicate his life to training K9 dogs. Daniel used what little money he had to start small. He reached out to police departments, shelters, veterans organizations, anyone who would listen. First, no one wanted to work with him. A former death row inmate, a man once called a murderer, they turned him away, until one man, the warden of the very prison where he had been held, stepped in. He had watched Daniel for years, seen the change in him, seen the man behind the conviction. And so, with the warden's backing, Daniel got his first opportunity, a chance to train dogs for prisoners. The idea was unheard of at first, but it worked. Daniel spent hours working with men who had once been like him, forgotten, angry, broken. He taught them how to train dogs, how to understand them, how to become something more than their past mistakes. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt at peace. One day, years after his release, Daniel received a letter. It was from the warden. "You should come back." Daniel hesitated. He had sworn never to return to that place, never to step foot inside those walls again. But something inside him told him he needed to go, and so he did. When he arrived, the warden led him down the familiar halls. The same cold concrete, the same steel bars, except this time he wasn't a prisoner. This time he was the one bringing hope. He walked into the prison's K9 program, where a dozen men stood beside young dogs, their hands steady, their voices strong. They were learning, changing, becoming something better. And as Daniel stood there, watching them work, he realized something. This was his purpose now. Not revenge, not anger, just second chances. Years later, a journalist tracked Daniel down. She wanted to write a book about his life, about Ace, the dog who refused to forget. Daniel sat across from her in a quiet coffee shop, a steaming mug between his hands. "You know," she said, flipping through her notes, "what Ace did for you, it was incredible. The way he waited, the way he never moved on." Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "It wasn't just about waiting," he said. The journalist raised an eyebrow. "Then what was it?" Daniel looked out the window, his fingers tapping gently against the table. "It was belief." She frowned. "Belief." Daniel nodded. "Ace never doubted me. he said quietly. Not once. When the whole world turned against me, when everyone thought I was a killer, when I had given up on myself, he never stopped believing in me. The journalist's pen stilled on the page. Daniel exhaled, his gaze distant. That's what saved me. Not just that he waited, but that he knew the truth before anyone else did. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, the journalist whispered, "Dogs just know, don't they?" Daniel smiled. "Yeah, they do." And with that, he stood, leaving the past behind him. For the first time in a long time, he walked forward, toward the future Ace had fought to give him. Some stories aren't about miracles. Some are about loyalty, redemption, and second chances. Ace didn't just wait for Daniel. He saved him, not with words, not with actions, but with unwavering, unconditional belief. If you believe in the power of love, of loyalty, of second chances, then join us in sharing more stories that prove dogs are more than just pets. They are family. Subscribe now and let's keep telling the stories that matter. Because sometimes the ones who never stop believing in us are the ones who walk on four legs.